Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 104. I recently sat down with Bart Hansen of Dane, Cellars and the Winemakers podcast. He gave me a great tour of some of the historical winemaking artifacts near his tasting room in Glen Ellen, and we had a great conversation in his tasting room, the Tank. Bart has always been so nice and interested in the podcast, and the Winemakers podcast is one of my favorites. He's been able to make Sonoma Valley his winemaking home his entire career and produces some great wines from the valley. They all show his great craftsmanship and sourcing. A reminder that I have a Patreon at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast. Link is in the show notes also. If you're enjoying the podcast, any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. It's all run independently, much like the producers I talk with. Telling a friend or sharing on social media are great ways to help out too. Here we go.
I remember being a kid and they had an old redwood tank, a small one.
Yeah.
And I remember that smell of fermentation going to visit during harvest.
Yeah.
And then realizing later in my life what it was, right? This is like when I was in my teens.
Yeah.
So his father-in-law was still doing it at that point, which is so cool. There you go. So this is 21. Leave it on the floor so it doesn't make noise. 21 Rossi. So this is Grenache Mourvedre. I believe this is 6832. It's on the back though. I can't remember. The 21 and 22 are slightly different.
55-45.
55-45.
Yeah.
So this was the year that was just a little more Mourvedre than what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point I had committed to just fermenting things together.
Okay. Okay.
Just because it's definitely more harmonious.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, what made you do like 25% whole cluster?
Previous experience.
Okay.
You know, it's something that I started kind of getting into. I think the first time I really saw benefit was in my 2018 Le Chamazal, because Le Chamazal Zin, because at that point, before 16, 17, I was still picking pretty ripe. I was still like, no, it needs a little bit longer.
Okay.
But with Zin, that's just not the right call.
Mm-hmm.
When I reflected back on like 2012, the Zins, where the grower kind of pushed me to pick a little sooner because of the weather, I went back and looked at those wines, and those wines were definitely less over the top extraction.
Yeah.
And so after tasting stuff with stems for a while and realizing there was another layer of like complexity to it, and it just counteracted some of the overripeness. 2018, of course, wasn't a super overripe year. It was a year that you could have left them hanging through November. The weather was cooperating. But that was the first time I really did it in Zinfandel.
Okay.
And it added I'm going to say an herbalness, but it's probably not the right description of the herbalness. And it's the same thing with the Valeria. It has a certain, aromatic thing that comes from the Rossi Ranch being surrounded in the oak woodlands, but also the stems just add a little extra layer of complexity.
Mm-hmm. It feels like Zinfandel maybe is one that people are a little worried about doing whole cluster. It smells amazing though.
Thank you. This was both the 21 and the 22. I had bought a large format puncheon that I had intended to put some Chenin Blanc in, but that was when the amphora broke. Did you hear that story?
Yeah. Did.
And so therefore I didn't have the wine to put that into. And so I ended up using it first on the 21.
Okay.
Let me make sure that's right. Yeah, I think it was the 21, left at the 21 for a while, and then rotated the 22 into it after being in old barrels. And it's funny, when I first pulled the wines to bottle and tasting them, I was like, you overdid it on the oak. But I'm starting to become more comfortable with it now.
I feel like it's integrated itself.
My problem is that I was such an oak junkie from when I worked at Kenwood, because that was kind of my era, or my responsibility was the barrel cellar, and so I had to be the expert on what new barrels did, and
Okay.
be able to answer questions for the winemaker. Like, well, what's giving this? And so I got to the point where I was like just in love with new oak.
Okay.
It didn't matter if it was French, American. It's just like, and I think I burned out on it. And then when I started working for the Benzigers, and we still used a lot of new oak on certain wines, other wines we didn't. And I realized how far I'd gotten away from just really truly loving fruit in wine.
okay.
So, and it was also of the era. That was during we were chasing the cult, the cult wines of the world, trying to be the Sonoma version of that. So.
Right.
Anyway.
So more ripeness,
Yeah.
more oak,
Yeah.
just bigger.
Lower pH and
Yeah.
higher pH, lower acid.
Yeah. It's plush.
Flush.
How did you end up at Kenwood?
So I started, to back up, I grew up in Petaluma, and went to high school at Petaluma High. Going to college was never on my radar, so to speak. My dad was a painting contractor, and I was just always going to work for him and, maybe take over the business at some point. And he passed away when I was a junior in high school. And so that all of a sudden I was like, well, maybe I should go to college. And not really having the grades, and again, not being part of it, I didn't get in anywhere.
Okay.
So I went to the JC, and I worked at a record store, and I had a lot of fun at the record store. So I continued not to be a great student, but saw a lot of epic concerts in the 80s and 90s.
I bet.
Or in the 80s. And my mom said, wouldn't it be fun to work at a winery?
Okay.
She really thought that it would be, a fun opportunity. She encouraged me just to go and knock on doors and ask, what were the opportunities. And so I went to Buena Vista, to the tasting room. And at that point, Buena Vista was owned by the German company Moller Rocky. And they weren't making wine there. It was just a tasting room.
Okay.
And it was before it had been redone. And they had nothing. So I was like, well, maybe I'll drive to Healdsburg, because I know there's wineries in Healdsburg. And so this is 1986. I'm driving up Highway 12, and I see this Kenwood Vineyards. I pull into the driveway, and I happen to park next to a guy in a big black Chevy pickup. And I was looking around. He asked me if I needed some help. And I asked where the office was, pointed me in the right direction. The receptionist said they weren't hiring, but to fill out an application anyway. And during that time, the same guy walked in, and he said, so you're looking for a job? And I'm like, yeah. And he says, when you're done, come into my office. So I finished it. I walked back into the office. His name was Mike Lee. He was one of the owners and the winemaker at Kenwood. And he tried to scare me. He was like, he goes, we have opportunities. Harvest is coming. What do you know about the wine industry? And I was like, nothing. And he says, we work 16 hours a day for 2.5 to 3 months. Don't plan on any days off. We pay you time and a half. We'll feed you lunch, and there's always donuts and stuff around. And you'll have more fun than you can imagine. And that was it.
Yeah.
I signed up. I knew how to drive a 4-wheel drive pickup. I knew how to back up a trailer, and I had experience driving tractors, and that was enough.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I started about a month later, and I started working literally in the vineyard. So I started probably on the first day of harvest. And so I met this guy, Jim, and we used to pick into 5-ton gondolas at the time.
Okay.
Trailer behind gondolas. And we would go up into the vineyard. We would be up there before the sun rised with the empty gondolas, and we'd stage them with the tractors. And the crew would arrive or would be there, and they'd all be, talking and waiting for the sun to come up and sharpening their knives, making breakfast tacos. And my job was while I was in the vineyard, was to move the tractor if it needed, to pass buckets and pull leaves. And then the minute that gondola was full, back truck up and get out of there. Go to the winery, weigh the grapes, dump the grapes, and get back out in the vineyard.
Nice.
And so that was my first harvest. And, at that point, Kenwood was definitely not a Sonoma Valley. I mean, they were a Sonoma Valley winery. We bought a huge amount of grapes from here in the valley, but we also contracted in areas outside. But we never had to bring that fruit in. We only brought in fruit that, we were either helping farm or farming here.
Okay.
So it was pulling 5-ton gondolas out of the mountaintop vineyards that, Montecillo, Upper Beltane, Jack London, what is now Mountain Terraces, all over the place here in the valley. And a whole bunch of old vine Zin vineyards.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah. And we made white Zin out of those old vines. We always made a small amount of red Zin, but the majority of the wine that we made out of those old vineyards was white Zinfandel.
Okay.
We had a Sonoma Valley white Zinfandel at the time. So anyway.
Yeah, so just working hard and working fast. And
working hard, working fast.
Pretty far.
Job was supposed to end in November. When November came around, I was kind of thinking maybe I'd try to find a job in Tahoe working as a ski bum.
Okay.
Much to my mom's chagrin, I'm sure. But it ended up working out and they kept me on. And I got transferred down to the warehouse.
Okay.
So there was no space in the cellar, and I didn't know anything about winemaking anyway. At that point, I really only was in the winery. At the end of the day, I'd help clean up, wash out tanks. During the time of shoveling tanks, if you had time to shovel tanks, you'd get in and shovel tanks. But again, never really getting any lessons on what was actually going on, mixing up yeast, helping dump it in, but not understanding any of it, not knowing anything about the formulas and the reasons why we were doing things. It was all just need to know basis.
Were you just in the right place at the right time with getting continuing past harvest?
Complete. Well, I'd like to say I worked my ass off.
Yeah.
And I made a good impression.
Yeah.
But that is what it was. It was right place, right time, and the right company. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It was, Mike Lee was my boss. I answered to him every day. His brother and brother-in-law were there every day. And that's the way they were. Everybody that I worked with had been there for a number of years at that time. We only had one token Davis grad. Okay. The rest were all people that, we had an assistant winemaker who had a background in chemistry. We had, other people that kind of grew up in Sonoma and had worked at Chateau Saint Jean or had worked for the Bundschuhs. So that's kind of what the team was. Mm-hmm. So I went down to the warehouse. They first started me out on the pallet jack. Okay. And I would pull orders because we warehoused most of our wine there. Mm-hmm. Okay. And we did shipping and receiving. And then bottling started, and then I would help out and started learning about running the bottling line. I graduated to forklift, and then, bring glass, take bottles away, stack. And again, shipping and receiving. And all during that time, because I knew how to drive a large truck, I would move tractors for the vineyard crew. Okay. So I was getting out of the winery also. And, again, you fall in love with these vineyards, being up there by yourself or early in the morning or with the entire crew. So it was really just I fell in love with what it was.
Mm-hmm. Just the day in and day out of the job.
And so the first 2 years, with the exception of harvest, I really just worked in the warehouse.
Okay.
And again, delivering wine, any number of things that had to do with that part. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until this gentleman by the name of Steve Sullivan, who took a sabbatical from Kenwood and went to Australia. Steve came back after Australia and started a company called Stavin.
Oh, okay.
Which, have you heard of that? Yeah, they make the inserts for the barrels.
Right.
He was the first, guy that really did that on a large scale.
Was he? Okay.
There was Interstave, but Interstave wasn't about the barrels. He actually had 60-gallon stainless barrels, and he felt like you could emulate a barrel with it. Mm. And so when he left, that opened up an opportunity in the cellar, mm-hmm. or at least in the barrel side. And so the job was supposed to be that I would come in the morning and I would pull barrels out of the cellar for the crew to start pumping and filling barrels. And I'd go back to the warehouse and pull orders. And they would have me come back and then move barrels when they needed them.
Okay.
And I was like, I just found myself like taking control of the barrel cellar, took on the part of inventory and knowing where everything was and organizing things, as opposed to someone coming and saying, move this here and this there. It was more of like, I'll just put them places and I'll learn from there.
How big was Kenwood at the time?
So that's a great question, because I really don't believe people understand what at least the wine business was in, call it late 80s to 90s. Kenwood was about 180,000 cases when I started.
Okay.
And 12 years later when I left, we were at about 275. And understand, at that point, that's what everybody was, right? Like 100,000 cases, 250,000 cases, that was like the sweet spot. That's what St. Jean was, and that's what Gunlock Bunchu was. Of course, Sebastiani's were bigger. St. Francis was smaller, like we were. But that's kind of where it was. What we have now of 1,000 cases to 5,000, and then 5,000 to 8,000. Those wineries didn't exist. Now 250,000 case a year wineries don't exist, at least not to my knowledge, really. So
yeah, it went from being maybe the sweet spot to kind of, I guess, an awkward size.
Well, and then the other thing is that, remember, direct to consumer wasn't available in the early 80s. It was 1986 was when they first started changing the legislation to be able to ship to your home. You could come to the winery and you could ship to yourself, but if you lived in California, you couldn't ship out of state at all.
Okay. And
so again, there was no direct to consumer business, and if you had it, you were blessed because they came to you. So it was all about distribution. And we would sell truckloads to Safeway, like 22 pallets of a wine to Safeway. And we would send pallets to, distributors across the country. Sometimes we'd have to move them to a place where they were all co-opt and shipped together. It'd be 3 or 4 pallets going to Wisconsin, but that was the business at the time.
Okay.
And direct to consumer was not. So we were a larger winery. We'd do 3,000 tons for harvest. And now, there's not a lot of people doing that number unless they're doing 3,000 for one brand that's owned by a larger brand. So
you were able to take control of the
barrel cellar, and that's where so then during those years, so let's say starting in 1990 is when I started to actually have a role in the winemaking team. I got to come to tastings. I got to have an opinion on blends. And it was just that. What is your opinion? Do you like this or this? And that's where I was kind of introduced to actually the nuance of tasting wine. Where before that, even though we would go finish all the open bottles every day in the tasting room, there wasn't a lot of social discussion. It was a social discussion. It wasn't a lot about how are the wines tastings. And there was always, my friend Mark Stupich, who was the cellar master there for years. Mark always liked to talk wine, but again, I just sat and listened because I was really learning. I knew I liked Zinfandel and I knew I liked Sauvignon Blanc, and that was about it. Then it was, then I was in the cellar full time, and we didn't do barrels every day, although it seemed like we did. Okay. But, racking tanks, learning pressing. I didn't get to press as much because, again, I was always running the barrel cellar. And during harvest, there was always barrels to fill because we always needed room in the winery. For new grapes coming in. So we used to always be under the gun to get more stuff in barrels to free up tanks, so that way they could crush more fruit.
Yeah. And you stayed there about 10 years or so?
It was 12 years there.
12 years, okay.
And it was Corbel. So 2 of the partners in the winery decided they wanted to retire. And so Corbel, Mike and his brother-in-law John went looking for an investor because they weren't ready to quit. Gary Heck from Corbel purchased 50%, and that was kind of the beginning of the end.
Okay.
I could see things were different. I was used to working for Mike and John, and when you did something good, you heard from them, and when you screwed up, you heard from them.
Okay.
For right or wrong. And trust me, I screwed up a lot.
But that's a good way to run it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like a family
Yeah.
family business and people that care.
And it was all different with Corbel. It was, there were things that were happening that happened at Corbel that we had to change to. We had, during harvest, we used to have crush lunch every day, and it was a real treat. I mean, it was a real lunch. It wasn't just cold cuts. It was barbecued chicken and hamburgers and steaks and pasta, and that ended immediately and my coworkers couldn't understand, like, well, we're different. We should be able to do this. And it was like, there's 100 people that work at Corbel, and they're not going to start feeding the people at Corbel, And so that was the beginning of the changes. And I was joking with a friend who worked for the Benzigers, and he was giving me a hard time about, like, are you going to be looking for a new job? And I said, I don't know. Do you have one? And he said, well, actually, we do. And so I applied for the assistant winemaking position at Benziger, which was specifically working with Joe Benziger and his brother Mike. Mike had come back into production because Mike, being the president of the company, was out on the road promoting and kind of removed himself from the winemaking during the whole Glen Ellen to Benziger transition.
Okay.
Right?
So they're selling the wines.
Selling the wines, being the face of the brand. Chris was very young at the time, Chris was my age at the time, but wasn't at that point. And so Joe, of course, was doing the imagery wines. So at the time, it was unique varieties from unique places. We were, bottling, single bottling Mourvedres and Grenaches and Petite Syrahs and you name it.
Yeah.
So that was real fun to be exposed to all those wines. And then Mike Benziger, they had started the conversion of going from conventionally farmed to biodynamic farming at the estate. And
yeah, how was that transition working out, as far as they were pretty early on, probably in that, and I don't know, maybe not too many people to bounce ideas off of, and I could see that maybe there'd be like growing pains kind of from it.
So there definitely was, and the cool thing about it is that Kenwood had converted about 250 acres to organic farming.
Okay.
And they did it for the farm workers that worked for them. Kenwood had a full-time vineyard crew that farmed all these properties that they either leased or owned.
And these are mostly Sonoma Valley.
All Sonoma Valley, yeah. And they converted it all to organic farming. But it was about, John used to say, we'll never advertise this. We're doing this for, the people that work in the vineyards, and because it's the right thing to do. And so that experience was there. I understood. We were beyond the vineyard had to look like it had never been touched. Although Chewy Ordaz, who was our vineyard manager at the time, Chewy definitely tried to make every vineyard look like it was perfect, regardless if it was organic or not. But so that was not unfamiliar. But the whole biodynamic thing was a little out there for me. One of the first things we did was we buried cow horns with manure, or bull horns with manure. And so that was an experience, and understanding that. And so you're right, there really wasn't, we had a biodynamic consultant by the name of Alan York, and Alan passed away a number of years ago now. And Alan had come from the apple farm was actually from Louisiana originally, had been raised around farming his entire life. But through a connection in Santa Cruz and up in Boonville, that's where he kind of became organic farming.
So apple country on
apple
both
country
sides,
out there,
yeah.
And Alan was the consultant for Jim Fetzer. So, of course, before Kenwood and before the Benzigers, the Fetzer family was farming large swaths of organic up in Mendocino County. And, of course, there were other people before them also. So that was really, in my mind, where that kind of movement started.
Okay.
But Alan came down and was our consultant. We had Jim Fetzer, who had started Ciego Vineyards at the time. And that's where we were exposed to it, where we'd go up and, they had chickens that they were using the eggs for finding wines. The chickens would be turned out into the vineyard, and had these mobile chicken carts, chicken houses that they'd move around the vineyard. But that was about it as far as animals at the time. But they started doing the biodynamic preps. They started growing things to build those preps. So that's where we learned.
Okay.
And it was just a different kind of mindset. The concepts of the lunar movements seem to work. They seem to make sense. Although I do have to laugh now at that app that says, when wine. Do you know that app?
I do. I've never actually looked at it, but I know of it, I guess.
It is really funny because
and
you
days.
open it up and you look at it and it says, today is a bad day for wine. And I'm like, really? Do you really, is this the right thing we should be doing? Telling people, if you can convey to people that maybe on a root day, the wine will be less giving, that's one thing. But there's a lot of spirituality that goes into that. And when I first started Dane Cellars, people would ask me if I was going to farm or buy biodynamically grown fruit. And my response was always, there's none of that available. I'd like to buy organic fruit, but there was no biodynamic fruit available at that time. And I didn't have the finances to, ask people to farm that way. And you have to be full in to do that. Alan used to say, Bart, he said, we don't know how much the farming actually does because we're just getting started. We won't know for a few years to see how it's changing things. He said, but one thing for sure, he goes, not having those crutches to fall back on, you have to be incredibly well organized. And so therefore you have to make thoughtful decisions. And so therefore you're just going to make better wine by being more organized and making better decisions.
Yeah, it feels like some of, biodynamic and organic, it's just that spending time in the vineyard more and people are just more present and making those thoughtful decisions. There's not like a blanket thing you can just apply to it. You have to be out there.
Something that people talked about at the time was and this is true even today, I think, with Sonoma County Sustainable. Well, I mean, that's essentially basically, and I understand sustainability is about staying in business and it's everything. It's beyond grapes, right? It's, shipping, it's, where you purchase things, it's all that stuff. But one of the things that Sonoma County Sustainable allows you to do is still spray herbicides. And to me, there's just it makes no sense to spray a plant killer on top of the roots that your plant, is growing on. And so I remember them talking about how do you convert, or maybe you're not ready to convert. Well, instead of just saying, well, we're going to go out and do 2, herbicide passes every year, just blankety, maybe really think about it. And if there's parts of your vineyard that it's very rocky and you don't get much weed growth, then maybe don't spray there. Or if there's areas where you don't need a fungicide because of, from experience from being out in your vineyard, that you don't just spray the entire vineyard, you spray sections of it. And I know that may be much more thought of now, but in the 90s, it wasn't necessarily thought that way. Okay. It was still conventional farming, and then it was organic farming, So going back to the thoughtfulness.
Yeah.
And mind you, I know nothing about grape growing. I've been in a lot of vineyards and spent a lot of time there. But if someone said, here, we want to hire you as a grape, a vineyard manager, I would help them find somebody else.
Okay.
Because it's just not my skill set. My skill set's always been working in the cellar. I mean, I truly am a cellar rat by trade, much more so than a viticulturalist.
Did you tend to see any improvement or differences in the fruit as that biodynamic transition
For sure.
happened, and with fermentations and,
For sure.
and everything.
Especially fermentations, I think the vineyards, just looked healthier. They weathered through heat spikes and things better. But again, more hands-on, more eyes-on always helps with that. As far as fermentations, probably one of the biggest learning experiences there were giving up cultured yeast. There was a learning curve with that. Mm-hmm. Remember the first few times it was because it was putting Chardonnay into barrels without yeast.
Okay.
And going in every day, every morning, going in and doing bricks and temps.
Yeah.
And sticking your nose in it. And, yes, it smelled good. Yes, it smelled good. The third day, you're like, you put your ear to it. It's not pinging. You look with a flashlight. It's not pinging. You smell it. It's a little aldehydic. And I would immediately go, hey, we have a problem. And Mike, more so than anybody else, Mike would go, let's just check it tomorrow.
Okay.
Right? Mm-hmm. And you go back tomorrow and there would be a little bit of action on the top. You would see, some larger formations of bubbles and foam. But it would still maybe be a little aldehydic. Mm-hmm. And this is true still to this day, I think, with red wine fermentations. You're obviously putting dry ice on it, but you know when it's not quite right. And then all of a sudden the next day it's fully fermenting.
Yeah.
And then you're good. And sometimes with a red fermentation, you definitely have a fermentation starting, but the aromatics still aren't what you want. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like whenever it would get up to, once it crests 80 degrees, 85 degrees, those aromatics just took over. The fermentation esters took control. And then, fermentations definitely took longer. You had to be a little more patient. But we were always happy with it, and I don't think there was ever this idea that there was yeast coming in from the vineyard that was performing these fermentations.
Okay.
We understood that we had cultured yeast in the winery. Yeah. Because these were small programs that I was working on. We were still making the across the country available Benziger wines in part of this facility also.
Okay.
So there were bags of Priest de Moose, and there were bags of Rhone 257 around and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So I think, as we all know now, the yeast that starts the fermentation is not the yeast that usually finishes the fermentation. Studies have been done, and even if you're adding yeast, that yeast isn't necessarily what's getting the work done in your fermentation. So, so that, I think, again, what was actually finishing those fermentations, I think, whatever yeast those were, it got to the point where really what you were doing is you were managing the temperature. Okay. And trying to make sure that you weren't losing steam. And so that's where being able to warm tanks became really important. And especially because at Benziger, all of our fermentation tanks were outside. And they were jacketed with foam, but they were still outside. The bottom of the tanks were still exposed to cold air and whatnot. So it was really important because if you lost your temperature, you could typically realize that the yeast they were gonna struggle to finish.
Yeah, and that was your first time kind of working with native yeast. Kenwood was all cultured.
All cultured. Okay. Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was great celebration about adding yeast at Kenwood. It would be, at the end of the day, we always added the yeast at the end of the day typically. Okay. And it would be like, hey, you're not doing something, you're standing there drinking a beer, take this bag of yeast, measure out X amount of pounds and mix it up. And nobody used a stirring stick. We all did it by hand, right? Get that warm water. You didn't need a thermometer because you knew what temperature it would have to be. Mm-hmm. And you'd mix it by hand because you didn't want any clumps. It was always, someone was always walking by you and going, are you getting all the lumps out, Yeah. But it was something you could do at the end of the day. You could drink a beer or have a glass of wine while you mixed yeast. And then, when it was ready, someone would have you, temper it a little bit, add some juice, and get it in. And then you were officially done with the day. Okay. So, bags and bags of yeast. Yeah. And your hand always smelled like yeast.
Oh yeah. So I guess you had said you're dealing with some different lots, like Mourvedre, Petit
Yeah.
Syrah.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself kind of attracted to any certain
Totally.
varieties as
Totally,
you
yeah.
started working with some of these different grapes?
I got in trouble once at Benziger, at Kenwood, because after I had left, there was definitely they were happy for me, but Mike hated to lose me to the Benzigers because there was definitely competition between Kenwood and Benziger as
Okay.
far as in the marketplace, and the Kenwood guys or the Benziger guys were the young upstarts from New York, and the Kenwood guys were the Kenwood guys. And I remember the one thing at Benziger that was very apparent is that we were very interested in what other people were doing. Like, what were those wines of the world?
Okay.
And at Kenwood, we really focused on our local wines, but really the wines that we made. And there was a lot of talk about styles and discussions, tasting wines together, all the individual lots. Because we kept all the vineyards separate, and we did do different treatments here and there. Not a lot, but here and there. At Benziger, I think in the first week I was there, we did a competitive cluster, tasting of Cabernets. And the next one was, white Burgundies. And I had never had white Burgundy. I didn't, there were these old wines that were in our cluster, that I didn't understand. Because my tasting, I was very, very narrow in my tasting experiences, even after, 10 plus years in the business, because, my experiences was things that I drank.
So yeah, Benziger was kind of looking out into the outside world
For
more,
sure.
where Ken was just focused
on
very
our
internally,
own
kinda.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah. On our own, what we were doing. And so the wines of the world became apparent. At the time, Benziger had a Pinot vineyard up in Oregon, and we were looking to get into the Pinot business pretty big. Again, that was kind of a different department. So even though I got to go and taste those wines and learn, I got to go to Oregon, I got to go to IPNC a number of years. But again, learning about Burgundy, that was the first thing, was Burgundy. And then the next thing was, because Joe was making some GSMs and we were making a Carignan, and there was Viognier. So those things were introduced, and, someone would bring in a wine. And so there was definitely interest gaining from that.
Yeah.
The Girl and the Fig had opened. Okay. And at the time I was single, and my friend Nils and I would go to the Girl and the Fig, and we would order a Gingados or, Saint Joseph, and, try to figure out what it was. And, we didn't have those experiences. So it was really fun learning about those. And then I remember in 2000, I did my first trip abroad.
Okay.
And a group of us, I went solo, but I met up with two different groups of friends. One was a group of friends in Burgundy, and we all had set up tours at different places. We had a house in Neuilly St. George that we had rented, and every day we'd go out and go tasting. And so totally got caught up into Burgundy, right? And then a trip to the Southern Rhone, and we went to, being at Benziger, we had the co-brand connection. So we went to Chateau Montredon and Chateau Aquera. Excuse my pronunciations, but, that was a whole nother thing. Like walking out into those vineyards in Lyriac and those vineyards in Chateauneuf and not seeing any soil was like mind-boggling to me that could happen. And then walking into those old cellars where we were so focused on everything being so incredibly clean and precise, and it just didn't seem that way. These, concrete fermentation tanks in the Southern Rhone that had, were painted with epoxy, right?
Yeah.
Because most likely all the concrete had too many heavy metals in it. All those things that we know now that we didn't know.
Yeah.
And that was all very mind-opening. I remember taking pictures and talking to Mike Benziger about the mold growing on the caves in Burgundy, and him saying, you know, I said, but Mike, these are the wines you want to make, and look at it's so different. And he'd say, Bart, we want to make wines with the soul of Burgundy, but with the precision of Bordeaux.
Okay.
Because in his mind, the Bordelais were in white coats and used gloves to do everything.
Okay.
So, and if you ever met Mike Benziger, you would understand. Mike had a thing for wordsmithing things, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. This is really beautiful wine.
thank you. So that's really where the passion for that came. You know, when I started Dane Cellars, there was never kind of a thought of making Pinot Noir. The focus from the beginning was some Cabernet and some Zinfandel, and I wanted to make some different expressions of Zinfandel. There was actually no real thought of making any white wine either at the time.
Okay.
And then when I realized that it would be nice to have some white wine for a dinner, I went to Chenin Blanc. Was really what I wanted to make, and that was a whole nother kind of process because there wasn't much of it around. What was around and available for at the time was basically Clarksburg. You know, I remember being invited to a lunch that Tegan invited me to, and it was over in Napa. There was about 12 or 13 of us, and you know, Tegan and Craig Harmeyer, and Pax was there at the time. They all kind of knew each other, and you know, there were Mendocino vineyards that they were getting, and there were some Amador and Sacramento vineyards that weren't just the typical bulk wine, Clarksburg fruit, but they were all using all of it. And so I was getting mine from the Wilson family in Clarksburg. Kenwood used to buy a whole bunch of grapes from the Wilsons for the less expensive vintage red and vintage white programs.
Okay.
So I knew them, and they were happy to sell me, you know, some grapes or some juice at the time. Those early ones, actually, what would happen is that Clarksburg Wine Company bought grapes from them also.
Okay.
And so they would get like a truckload, and they would just agree to sell me off a couple 100 gallons of juice. And so I would go over with my containers in my truck, and I would load them up, and then I'd just transfer the juice back to Sonoma and then ferment it here.
Okay.
And so those were the first Chenin Blancs.
You've played around with Chenin from a couple other regions since then, right?
Once at some point, again, got a phone call from Tegan, and he was getting fruit from a vineyard up in Mendocino called Buddha's Dharma. And he was, I think he was getting out of that because he had more opportunities that weren't probably, you know, as far away from him at the time. And so at the time it was Hardy Wallace when it was Dirty and Rowdy. Okay. And myself and Pax. And we used to share this vineyard. I just, you know, got my 1 or 2 tons at the time. And so it was from up there from a number of years. And then at some point, the gentleman who farmed it, who I think is who the Buddhist colony bought the land from, his family had extensive acres that they were farming. He was told that they weren't going to be renewing his lease to farm the property, and the Buddhist colony just let the vineyard go fallow. Okay. Which was a real shame because there was some old vine Barbera up there. Oh, there was the Chenin. There was a bunch of Carignan. And it was organic. It was dry farmed, but that was just due to negligence. It was the Buddhist colony put no money into it whatsoever, and the gentleman farming, you know, had to make it work. Sure. But it worked. It made beautiful wine, made very special wine. And so after that happened, I was able to pick up a little bit of fruit from a vineyard over in Green Valley, Solano County. Oh, yeah. That Joel Burt from Los Jarras used to get the fruit from. And Joel would, I think, if I remember right, Joel had the lease on it, and so I would just buy a ton or two from him.
Okay.
And I just had to go pick it up and process it myself, which worked well because it wasn't quite as bad to drive back from Solano County as it did from Mendocino County in a truck that was totally overloaded with a trailer that was overloaded also. So, and so that was for a couple of years. And then, to be quite honest, I've been out of the Shannon game for a number of years now until just now. As a matter of fact, to the point of the whole hella Shannon tasting that goes on now. When that started, I didn't have anything available. I couldn't get on the list, and I think I'm still on the waiting list. But I just bottled some Chenin Blanc from the Ballantine Vineyard over in Napa.
Okay.
So 2025 Napa Valley Chenin Blanc coming from Dane Cellars here in the next month or so.
That's fun.
Super excited to be back in the program. And I think I can speak to this now. So the San Giacomo family planted or tea-budded over some vines to Chenin. And so they produced Chenin in 24 and 25. I talked to Steve San Giacomo the other day, and he thinks that he can get me some. So
wonderful.
Yeah, and again, the whole focus has always been to make Sonoma Valley wines because it is the only place I've worked all these years. So that would close that loop. So
yeah, what drew you to Chenin originally? What was it that's going to be the white wine for Dane Cellars?
It was experiential, really.
Okay.
I loved Sauvignon Blanc. I had no interest in Chardonnay. It just never did it for me. And at Kenwood, we made, when I was there, we made 30,000 cases a year of Sauvignon Blanc. Think about that for a little bit. That's a lot of Sauvignon Blanc. Yeah. And so I loved that wine, and so it was acid driven, it had complexities, it had aromatics. So also at the time, Kenwood used to buy quite a bit of Chenin for the Vintage Red and Vintage White program. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who don't know what that is, Kenwood, had the whole range of wines from white table wines, which was that. Mm-hmm. The red table was always Zinfandel based. And again, a lot of Lodi, Clarksburg fruit. Okay. And then the white wine was always Sauvignon Blanc based, and Chenin was part of it. And at the time, Kenwood also got the grapes from the Montecillo Vineyard here in Sonoma Valley in the Moon Mountain District. It was owned by Bob and Gary Lopez. And that is where, of course, that world famous Montecillo Cabernet is grown. Yeah. But also up there at the time, there was Chenin Blanc and there was Gewürztraminer.
Oh. Okay.
When I was at Kenwood.
Okay. And
eventually that was tea-budded over to Zinfandel or replanted, maybe a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. But we used to do a Sonoma Valley Chenin Blanc at Kenwood, and it was always a wine that I really enjoyed and really liked. Mm-hmm. When, again, going back to a white wine, it spoke to me. It's what I was interested in doing. Not everybody was doing that. There were still a lot of people in the Sauvignon Blanc game, which maybe is why I didn't do that. And I was trying to figure out something that was something a little bit different. Mm-hmm. I remember people going, well, why don't you just make some Chardonnay and, get it from the San Giacomos? And I remember saying at the time, does the world really need another San Giacomo Chardonnay? Sorry, Mike. Sorry, Steve. But, it's true, and
and if you don't feel like you can do or make something unique with it, what's it doing? Where does it fit, kind of?
It's kind of the same thing with Pinot Noir. Is that during the time that I started Dane Cellars, so that was started in 2007. Really weren't selling any wine till 2009, 2010, and again. Very, very small and very inward thinking, not looking at the whole world. Mm-hmm. I was just trying to do a passion project. I had to make the wines that I was really interested in. And there were already people doing Pinot Noir that were the rock stars. And
Right.
this, guy without, ever being a head winemaker somewhere or, having that title or having the press, why just be one amongst, And so always like looking for Rhone-based varieties, which again, 2010, 2011, the Rhone varieties that were being grown in Sonoma Valley were not anywhere near what they are now. And they were probably owned, farmed and owned by a winery that did something with it. There was stuff up in Dry Creek, and there were definitely Central Coast, and Paso Robles was definitely much more the hotbed for it than what it,
Right.
Not that it's the hotbed here now, but we're definitely established that Rhone varieties do very well here now.
Yeah. Did you have trouble kind of finding them at the?
I did. There was Syrah available, of course, because Syrah was
Syrah.
planted everywhere at the time, right? And so the first time I made a couple of Syrahs from the Lassiter's property because I did my time when I worked with them during this time, and so there was extra fruit there that I was able to make, and that was it was definitely more of a warm climate. Syrah, but it was a warm, cool spot because it was valley floor, and it was in a narrow part of the valley that had limited sun exposure. So it wasn't like a typical hot climate Syrah.
Kind of got hot, but not for too long.
Correct. And I was able to pick it before it went over the top. But then there was a vineyard in Kenwood, sits on the hill above the Pagani Ranch. And this was a 1970s planted vineyard. Of all things, there was a block of Chenin Blanc up there that had been torn out.
Okay.
But they had this block that was probably 60% Syrah and then 10% Grenache, Mourvedre, and a little bit of Viognier. And so I was able to, that was the first time I made a GSM blend.
Yeah.
And that was from that vineyard. And that vineyard was very much in disrepair or being repaired is maybe, the vineyard manager was trying to resurrect the vineyard. It was on a low budget, but the people that owned it wanted to see what they could do with it. So I was able to get some fruit from that. And that was kind of the start of that. And then I was on the list to wait for some fruit from the Steel Plow Vineyard, which is a vineyard that Phil farms or farmed. And somehow I didn't have to stay on that list. There was a little bit of Grenache available up at Rossi. And so I bypassed Steel Plow and went straight to Rossi.
Okay.
And so 2018 was the first Grenache that I made from Rossi. And then in 2019, we added in a little bit of Mourvedre. And then 20, we didn't get any fruit. And since then, we've just gone back with Grenache and Mourvedre every year.
Okay.
I've never requested any Syrah. And I kind of came to that decision in that, well, originally when I made the Syrah and the Grenache, I intended to make two different wines.
Okay.
And so I fermented them separately. And when it came down to tasting them, does one need a little of the other to kind of amplify it?
Yeah.
Both of them kind of could be called one direction wines, right? That need a little bit of something else. No matter what blends I put together, both myself and my colleagues that I would have taste with me, everybody was like, the sum of the whole were better than the individual pieces.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was the 2019 Rossi blend that we call Valeria. And then since then I've just adapted to fermenting them together.
Yeah.
And what I always found when I worked for the Lassiter family, and the Lassiters were early adopters to Grenache and Mourvedre, or Rhone varieties, I should say. We would spend a lot of time on the blends trying to determine how much Syrah to put into it. And what I was always struck by was how just a little too much Syrah made the entire wine taste like Syrah.
Right.
And what I loved about the wines from the Southern Rhone were they're definitely full-bodied and can be massive, but there was a certain essence of aromatics and lift that you got out of them. And in my unscientific brain, I always thought, if you look at the other varieties that are in Chateauneuf that we don't have exclusively here in Northern California, all those other varieties kind of combat what the Syrah would do. And let me know if you think I'm onto something here, right? So the Grenache and Mourvedre are what they are, but the other 11 varieties or so, the Cinsault, the Carignan, right, the Beurre Blanc, all those things counteracted the Syrah, right? And so with not having those available, it was always going to be the Syrah that you would be wondering, like, how much do you go into it with? And so with removing it, I think, to me, it's a wine that inspires me to that area more than if it had a 10% Syrah in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a full wine, but it feels like really kind of light on its feet and super aromatic also.
And I have discovered that I am an aromatics guy. You know, I remember listening to a podcast, and I don't remember if it was a podcast from Cody from Desire Lines or if it was Morgan from Bedrock, speaking to the other one and talking about like doing their blends and working together. And I think it was Cody that said it, that Cody was much more into the aromatics and Morgan was more caught up in the texture and the finish.
Okay.
And I remember thinking, you know, well, what am I? And I'm definitely a lover of aromatics, man.
Yeah.
Like if you can get something that pops out of the glass and makes you consider, like, what is that? That's what drives me, you know. Textures change in the bottle. Textures change while you're drinking it. Textures change over time. And as long as it's got texture, that's the most important thing. But if you can stick your nose into it and go, what is going on here?
Yeah.
That's got me.
Yeah, there's sometimes those wines you almost don't want to take a sip,
right?
Because of the aromatics and everything just hit you so fully. You're hesitant.
Well,
hesitant
and it's funny to go back to barrels. Like, I got the chance to go on a barrel trip to Missouri one time.
Okay.
With World Cooperage, and it was 50 bourbon makers and 50 winemakers. And during the day, we'd each go into our rooms and do all these extensive tastings. And then in the evening, there'd be a meal and a party at the end of the night. And so that's where I was like introduced to bourbon, and not knowing anything about bourbon. Like, bourbon's all about the barrels, right? And all about the char.
Right.
But there are bourbons and, for that matter, very good cognacs. Like, I don't necessarily have to drink them. I just want to sit there and smell them. And so, but that's the full barrel effect, right?
Yeah.
And so I do get caught up in the aromatics.
Yeah. And that's probably, some of this is probably the whole cluster adding to that.
I think so. I mean, especially the 2019, I'm going to send you home with a bottle of the 2019 that you can drink on your own. That is like, to me, the last time I had a bottle of it, aromatically, it was all that. And it's the whole cluster. It's you can smell that, that beautiful, I don't know that we have Garrigue here in California the way they speak of it in France.
Chaparral, I guess.
Chaparral, right. But, Sam and I always talk about, like, Rossi has an aromatics to it.
Yeah.
That you can find through different producers. And probably more so in Grenache and Mourvedre than the Zinfandel that's out there. But it definitely has something to it. So.
Yeah, and well, you produce some great Zinfandel also,
Thank you.
and It seems like you choose your vineyards pretty carefully for that, like kind of legendary Zinfandel spots.
Again, so going back to like my wine knowledge and learning at Kenwood at the time, it was very much the days of the 3 R's of Zinfandel, right? It was Ridge, Ravenswood, and Rosenblum. But Kenwood was very much in the Zinfandel game. Like those early days of Zap, we went to all those tastings and poured. And when I was there, we made 7 different Zinfandels.
Okay.
5 of them were from Sonoma Valley, and they were all old vine. And then we had just a Sonoma Valley blend also. And then we had a Lodi Old Vine Zin that we did.
Okay.
So it was very much a passion of the whole teams. And again, with it being the wine that I fell in love with, every time I got to go to a tasting, it was always hunting down the Zins. And one of the first 2 Zins here in Sonoma that I remember really identifying with was the Ravenswood Old Hill and Los Chamazal. So it was Haywood Winery at the time. Haywood Winery, the Los Chamazal Rocky Terrace. And so Peter Haywood, who owned Haywood Winery and built and planted Los Chamazal, Peter started, I think, sometime in the mid 70s. And at some point, he ended up selling his winery to, of all places, the Racky company, the German wine company.
Okay.
And they took Haywood Winery and grew it into a pretty large brand. But Peter always just sold all of his Zin to that. It kind of became more of a grocery store wine than a vineyard designated wine. But they always made 2 small lots, which was Rocky Terrace and Morning Sun. Okay. And it was just 2 different distinctive parts of the vineyard. It's a very large Zinfandel vineyard.
Okay.
And so after Peter had sold it, eventually they sold the Haywood brand back to Peter. Okay. And so Peter resurrected his little brand, making just a small amount of wine. So he had grapes for sale. And I had heard that, and so I approached him about buying some grapes. So that was 2009.
Okay.
Was the first year that I made it from that vineyard. So it was that vineyard, and then there was an old vineyard over just outside of town, which was it was probably more of a mixed blacks vineyard than anything else. But I was told it was Zin, so therefore it was Zin. And it was a funky vineyard because all the vines had a cane that was at this point, for 2 or 3 inches thick. That was pruned up out of the ground and then, had been connected to the vine that was growing. And what I was told was that at some point a vine had died and they just took a cane and they buried it and then resurrected the new vine up from it.
Right, like a layering
thing, and it was an economy thing more than anything else, and usability.
Yeah,
and this was not a vineyard. This was not a vineyard that was necessarily, maintained for quality. It was more of was to keep it in production. And so I worked with that vineyard for quite a while, and it was really fun because it was definitely had other varieties. So those were the first 2. And then a vineyard over off of Carragher Road that was called Gopher Run that we've made wine off for a number of years, planted to 95% Zin and 2.5% Alicante and 2.5% Petit. Okay. Not an old vineyard by any mean, but head pruned on really rocky soils, kind of a valley floor, sits at the base of Sonoma Mountain. And so that, and then most recently, when the Bunshu family purchased what was Old Valley, the Moon Winery.
Oh, yeah.
So they call it Rancho Agua Caliente. So that vineyard where Abbott's Passage is now, that was at one point the same vineyard as Bedrock and other vineyards that have since been, gone away. And so those are 1940s planted vines.
Okay.
And the fun thing about that was for me is that when I worked at Kenwood, we had purchased Valley of the Moon Winery. And so we actually worked with that fruit for a number of years when I was there.
Okay.
And then so it was kind of a fun full circle thing to come back.
Yeah, definitely.
If I could, I'd love to keep making, wines off of old Kenwood vineyards that, have either just gone into large bottlings because there were some beautiful old vineyards, but we'll see. But yeah, kind of those, vineyards that mean something that I feel I have a connection to.
Yeah, it must be kind of cool visiting them 20 years
For sure.
later and
For sure.
seeing the changes.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of them, the farming has maybe changed
Yeah.
quite a bit, and like new owners or
Absolutely,
what have
absolutely.
you.
I mean, Kenwood with the Rancho Agua Caliente vineyard, no doubt that since the bunches have taken over and changed it to regenerative organic, the farming has gone up very high quality. Los Chamazal vineyard for years, Peter was a very good farmer, and it was not certified organic, but he really didn't use much herbicides, if any, in the blocks that I was in. And he used to say just because he didn't need to, because it was so rocky, nothing grew up there anyway.
Okay.
And they could just manage the weeds by, cultivating. So that's always been really important. I just recently was able to make some Cabernet from Montecillo,
Oh, wow.
which has gone, full circle farming. And so we'll have a 2024 Montecillo Cab, and hoping to make some more wines from up there. They have some Zin that's probably available.
Oh, nice.
So it'll be fun to go back to that vineyard. So
Yeah, it's amazing you've been able to stay, for the most part, so kind of enclosed in the Sonoma Valley your entire career, like showing up at a winery asking for a job
Right.
to now and the vineyards.
Yeah,
and everything.
thank you. I feel so fortunate to be able to do that. Although the reality has come to a point that I was somewhere fairly recently, and the conversation turned around and said, well, Bart, you were probably around when that happened. And so I've become the old guy in the room to some extent. But that's okay. I'll wear it well. I'll wear it proudly.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
No. And you know what? And it would be awesome to be able to make wine from all these vineyards all over the place, right? Like so many people do, driving all that time. But the whole thing about starting Dane Cellars is the reason why we started it is that I worked for the Benzigers at the time. My wife and I had our first child at 42 years old. She works in the city and worked New York hours. So she's out of the house every day at 4:00 in the morning.
Wow, yeah.
And so I became the stay-at-home dad. I was Mr. Mom.
Okay.
And I didn't have time to drive around and look at vineyards. And because I was here, and this is where my relationships were, it just made more sense. And Sonoma Valley is diverse. Sonoma Valley, from Carneros down by the bay, when you start to come up valley to Glen Ellen and you get up into these hillsides and, the different aspects of, Sonoma Mountain and the different aspects of where vineyards are planted on Moon Mountain, there's so many things, so many different places to grow. I think the biggest difference between Rancho Agua Caliente and Los Chamazal, this is a great side-by-side tasting, is that Rancho Agua Caliente is in the physical heart of the middle of Sonoma Valley, right? It's north to south. It sits in the middle. It's in the narrowest part of the valley, with the Mayacamas with Moon Mountain to the east and Sonoma Mountain to the west. And it's the hot spot of the valley. There's definitely thermal hot springs under the ground there. When the vines leaf out, they leaf out near Madrone Road first. When the buckeye trees start to lose their leaves, it happens there first. It's the first place you start seeing lupin. It's all those things. It's definitely the warmest area. but it's also does get the effect of, the other thing that doesn't necessarily happen is, when you get up to Kenwood, the fog comes in from the Santa Rosa Plains, which kind of helps cool that area. And, in the lower Sonoma Valley coming up through the bay. But a lot of times the fog doesn't make it up to Madrone Road.
Okay.
Right? It doesn't get past the state, the county park on Highway 12, and it doesn't get through Boys Hot Springs. So again, going back to that warmer area. Then you get down to where Los Chamizal is, which is the southernmost part of the Moon Mountain District. It's grown at about 800 foot of elevation. So it's definitely got elevation to it. But when you're up in the vineyard, you can see the bay. And so the fog comes in, and even though it may not come in and may not get all the way to the vineyard, it might be down below it. But as the fog burns off, it rises, and so it helps keep it cool. So it's a much cooler growing spot. Even though the soils are very shallow, the water availability is very little, it does take longer to get full flavor there.
Yeah, that sounds like a great side by side. And yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of grapes grown in the valley, different varieties.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot that you can work with.
It's fun.
Yeah.
And, and now, as you know, with sorbet,
Yes.
the, Sonoma organic, and it's Sonoma, I have to,
Organic, regenerative,
biodynamic educational tasting. So, this organization started by Morgan Peterson and Sam Katuri and Katie Bunchu. It was all meant just to kind of draw attention to what we have here in Sonoma. Is pretty cool in that over 20% of the vines planted in Sonoma Valley are being farmed those ways. And I think if you look at other appellations throughout California, it sits at about 4%. 4 to 6%.
Okay.
And so we're really fortunate that this movement is happening here. And
yeah, it seems like it's always been just such a farming focused area.
Yeah.
And yeah, people really relying on like high quality, responsible farming.
Well, and we're lucky because we have, again, the guys at Kenwood were talking about it in the late 80s, and the Benzigers doing it in the 90s. And of course, Phil Katuri, and his brother, starting well before all of them. So the ethos is here.
Yeah.
And then you have people like, Robert Kamen and the people from Repris and coming in and wanting to make high quality wines, Phil Katuri farming for them and reinforcing how important it is. And then you have, commitments like to the Bunchus, like, the Bunchus probably farmed organically before, the World War II and World War I, because that's what everybody did, right?
Yeah.
It was organic by fault. But then to farm conventionally for many, many years and then decide that, the next generations with Jeff and Katie wanted to move forward, that's a huge commitment. Them doing it really kind of pushed the needle to that percentage getting that high.
Okay.
And then you have Gloria Ferrar, converting all of their vineyards to organic.
Yeah.
Like that's huge and great. So hopefully it continues.
Yeah. Brad seems really on top of it there.
Yeah.
You want to talk about your tasting room?
The tank?
The tank.
It's interesting, people. Now, whenever I put something on social media, I always write the tank and I capitalize the T's because so many people, when this happened, people would say, "Oh, you're in the barrel," and you know what? That's great. It's actually kind of cool that it's the barrel, but it really is a tank, right? Like. A tank has a top and a bottom. A barrel doesn't have a top and a bottom. It has a head and it has, the staves.
Yeah.
And this tank holds a lot of history. And even though there's probably has been no wine made in it since sometime in, the 50s, it's been preserved. And there's a lot of spirit that goes along with it. And it's part of the living history of Sonoma Valley. So I consider myself very fortunate to be able to do this. And even though later in my career, I don't have to crawl into many tanks anymore because the tanks that I use are either bins that we just turn over or small tanks that we use the forklift, and flip them on their sides. The early days at Kenwood and Benziger, I spent a lot of times crawling into tanks, and you can see I'm a big guy, so it was always like crawling in the tank. I tried to do it when there weren't people around. Just get in the tank and hand me a shovel. But for someone who did that, and it was so much part of, how many tanks did you shovel this year?
Yeah.
That was very much the machismo part of the early part of my wine education. To be able to now to come into something like this and sit in comfortable chairs, and
you have a much bigger door here
than the
average tank.
Exactly. It's really fun. And then the other thing, I knew that if I went along with the barrel, there would be some wine historian, winemaker personnel that would say, it's actually not a barrel, it's a tank. And it is. They're right. It's a tank. So I've got it now to the point where a lot of people will go, hey, are you at the tank this weekend? Yeah. So, I haven't quite gotten to the shirts yet that say I got tanked in the tank.
Okay.
But,
They're coming. Yeah. You start with a pin or something.
Right, exactly. Maybe I need to not worry about perception and just go for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've driven past it. This is my first time inside of it, but it's actually more spacious than I was expected.
Yeah, I would agree.
Truth.
I mean, you definitely if you get 10 people in here, which we have done, it makes it a little hard to get around the room and pour wine for people. But yeah, it's meant to, have a group of 6 works great.
Yeah.
A couple of people at the bar, a couple of people in the chairs. We have a nice area outside that if you don't mind the cars driving by, it's a great place to sit outside. And then in what I call the winemaker's office, I have a large tank where I can take a group of about 10 people for a tasting, if they so choose to. But yeah, it's a really fun spot. And I'm happy to keep the history going with it. It's funny, there was, at one point, someone had told me that there was a therapist's office in here, and then it was a massage studio. Those are both confirmed. At one point, someone told me that it was a magician shop, but as I found out just recently, the magician shop there was actually a magician that lived in the little cottage behind the tank. So that part, I've had to change that part of my history, my history story.
But I mean, but it seems conceivable that it could be a magician's
right.
shop.
It does, doesn't it?
I wouldn't necessarily doubt it.
And then the other thing, and I there's no proof of this, but I showed you that picture of Sonoma Mountain in days many years ago, where you can see that it had been forested pretty well.
Yeah.
And we do know that side of the valley, Sonoma Mountain on the eastern flank of Sonoma Mountain, because it still has extensive redwood groves, that most likely the redwood from this tank was harvested here locally. And, they certainly weren't sending redwood up from Santa Cruz Mountains or from Northern California down to make tanks out of in Glen Ellen. I have to believe that it was probably made here locally.
I mean, if you can get it local, it's a lot easier than getting a boat or
especially
a train.
During that era, right? Like
wagon,
think about the logistics of it, and nobody did anything that way in that era. It just wasn't part of it. It's like we were saying earlier, just like the wines that were probably made in this tank probably never made it to fanciful bottles with cork finish, right? They were probably put into barrels and sent down to merchants, whether it was, on train across the country or to San Francisco by steamship from, Carneros, and sold into a merchant where you brought in your demijohn and bought your wine for the week and took it home.
I mean, you read a lot of stories about, people clearing this area for vines also back in the day. So some of it could have been a byproduct of that even.
For sure. And we do know that there was a lot of wine being made in this area, both pre and post Prohibition. I mean, you can find that from just going to the Sonoma County Wine Library and, reading the history of California wine. It's all there. That part's documented.
Yeah.
So there's, some mysteries among things like this and other ghost wineries. But there is certain amounts of history that is certified.
Yeah, I think it's documented here better than a lot of areas.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, for sure.
You want to tell people where they can get the wines if they don't know? I mean, you're on a podcast that's much more popular, and they probably know already. But if you
so I am part of the Winemakers podcast team with Brian Casey and Sam Katuri, and our new recruit Danielle Langlois, and so. That's been a great help with getting the word out of our little brand. But we have DaneCellars.com or at Dane Cellars on Instagram and other social medias. You can book a reservation at DaneCellars.com. Any sort of correspondence comes directly to me because it is truly a one-man shop. We obviously don't make wine here. I share space down on 8th Street East in Sonoma with two other winemakers where we're all one-man shops and we kind of help each other out and make the wines down there. But we're up here located in Glen Ellen. So come visit DaneCellars.com. I'd love to host you.
Yeah.
Listen
to the Winemakers podcast too.
Yeah, thank you. If you tell me that you heard about the podcast on the Indie Wine Podcast, we'll give you a free tasting. So
there you go. Anything you think we missed or glanced over that you want to?
No,
talk about?
I'm curious of you. I mean, this is something that's been talked about a lot, and if you don't mind, a few more minutes, I'm curious of your opinion on this.
Okay.
With all the negativity that's going in the press from all these luminary writers, and I understand they're trying to report what's going on. There's not a lot of positiveness going on.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, but I feel that there's some really cool stuff going on.
Some amazing stuff going on.
Like sorbet, like the fact that the segments that are really hurting in the wine business are kind of the lower end. And maybe the high end is hurting a little bit, but they'll survive the super high end.
Right.
But that's some pushback on, if there are less people drinking wine, we need to make it easier and more fun and approachable for them. And so I'm curious, what do you see positive going on? And what are you optimistic for? What keeps you wanting to have people on your podcast?
So I'm optimistic because I think there's a lot of great wine being made in California right now in this kind of middle area, I'd call it, like $20 to $60. I think there's probably as much good wine and interesting wine being made
than there ever has been
in a huge variety of styles. And, there's people doing projects that are like super specific or like close to their heart, like really focused, like either Spanish varietals, sparkling wines, only hillside vineyards.
Right.
Like there's people doing amazing stuff that is just kind of like they have like a laser focus. And I mean, in a way, not unlike Dane, where you're like really confined within the Sonoma Valley. There's people doing things like that and maybe even like more specific.
Yeah.
But I think those super kind of personal projects to people that really mean a lot to them. I also feel like anytime there's a downturn, like you said, I mean, a lot of it's like these larger wineries, lower end wines. I'm hoping some of the people that get kind of unfortunately bounced out, but that they can go on to do some really good things. I think anytime that there's, you see like vineyard sources available that weren't available, and obviously like there's a downside
Yeah.
to that, but there can be an upside to it also.
Yeah.
You took over and started working with a vineyard that had gone into maybe more of a production
Yeah.
style wine, but then you're taking care with it, making sure the vineyard is maybe farmed a little better, and taking care in that wine and kind of giving it a spot to shine. So I think that can happen with people also.
Yeah.
It feels like in like the 2008 kind of recession, there were a lot of like really good brands and projects and that popped out of
Yeah.
that.
Totally.
And now they're like, now some of them are like almost 20 years old, 15 years old. So I think sometimes you don't see it right away. It might take a couple years and to show itself, but
Yeah. I
those
completely
are some
agree
of the
with you.
things I'm excited about. And
I mean, you know what? I think one of the coolest things that's happened, and this has been going on for a while now, but the ability for people to make small amounts of wine, and so if you look at like the things that Morgan and Chris from Bedrock have done by, encouraging their employees. I mean, it's a little bit of golden handcuffs, right? Like, well, now we got you. Keep working here because you're making your wine here. But it allows those people to have their own artistic expression, which allows them to stay focused on their day jobs, right? Without getting frustrated with it and wishing they could do something different.
yeah,
And look at the wineries that have done that. The people that have come out of PAX, the people that come
Yeah.
out of
Rhyme has
done the
doing a
same
lot.
thing. Yeah.
Thomas Fogarty actually
Yeah.
in the Santa Cruz Mountains. They've been really supportive
Yeah.
of their staff there.
Yeah, like Nathan
also.
and- yeah.
Nathan, and I mean, Nathan benefited from it, and then there's Brad and
Yeah.
Katie that work there that both have their own
Okay. See,
projects.
those are two I don't
and,
know about.
And so they're like you get that mentorship, and people really learn high quality, craft wine production,
Yeah.
and kind of going off on their own.
And
I mean,
and then on the other side, it makes me really sad when I like the young lady from Margins Wine.
Megan, yeah.
Yep, she's unfortunately ending her program, and we exchanged messages because I always wanted to have her on the podcast, and we never got it to happen. And I said to her, if you ever feel that you want to come on, I'd love to have you on. Maybe with your next gig, whatever that is. And she was real positive about it. And listen, I'm fortunate in that my brand is very much a passion project, and we don't operate on much of a budget. It has to support itself. And again, I'm fortunate that I do everything myself. We have low income. I don't have huge rent here. That's why this is even here.
Yeah.
But our business is crazy, and you need the support of your community, and you need your support of your local people to do it. And I think what you're doing, and what I get a lot of joy out of with our podcast, is you're helping spread the word of these small brands.
Yeah.
Because nowhere is there ever going to be a group of people that say we only drink this winery's wine. And if that's the case, then you're boring anyway. So, for me, I feel like I'm able to give back to my community a little bit by helping them tell their story. And I appreciate what you're doing, because you're helping me tell my story. Even though I get to tell it to people, you have a different group of people that listen to yours than mine. And hopefully we can help both of those groups grow also. So,
Yeah, that's kind of what it's for, is to get the word out about people that are doing good stuff.
Yeah.
And just promote them, and California wine, I think in general, really.
Yeah.
I've always kind of had like a little pet peeve thing about like hyper local restaurants, and then like 9/10 French wine list, and I'm like, like I know there's producers that can make a comparable wine to this, or a wine in this style. Like I can name 4 off the top of my head that could make this, Rhone
Right.
blend kind of thing on the by the glass list.
Right.
And
I mean,
so I just want, I like California. I want California wine to succeed. I've lived here my entire life, and for a few generations, and
Yeah.
I love the state.
There's and I'm kind of the same way. Definitely California and California wines, but my hyper location with being Sonoma Valley specific, and one of the things that's going on here is we have a bunch of young winemakers that work, down in our, wine neighborhood down on 8th Street East and amongst these labels. And if you include the Custom Crush place up north of Kenwood, I'm drawing a blank on the name now. And a lot of these young winemakers are making wines that aren't from Sonoma necessarily. They go to Mendocino, they go to, the foothills or, some of these, the Central Valley areas or Central Coast looking for fruit. And yet we have growers here in Sonoma Valley who have traditionally always sold to the large producers, like we were saying earlier, and a lot of those large producers have left Sonoma Valley to, buy fruit. So we have these growers that used to sell to the Benzigers, that used to sell to the Kenwoods, who don't have those anymore because those wineries have left the valley as far as sourcing fruit, looking for cheaper fruit. I hope that what I'm trying to do is connect our local winemakers with our local growers who are looking for people, and hopefully trying to have these growers who grow something maybe open their mind to, there's this person here, they can't afford to pay you necessarily, as much as you were getting in those days, but and maybe they demand a little higher quality. Maybe they demand a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe they're 2 tons instead of 30 tons.
Right, but linking them together, and doing something unique, and finding a relationship. And maybe you could be the person that gets started with them buying 2 tons from you, and in 5 years, and this happens, all of a sudden they're buying 5 or 10 tons from you, and wouldn't you rather deliver your grapes from, Broadway and Highway 12 to 8th Street East, as opposed to having to drive to Geyserville?
Yeah.
Right? And likewise for you people looking for fruit, wouldn't you rather drive up to the end of, Garricky Road to find some fruit, as opposed to having to drive all the way to, Paso Robles?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that can work both ways for the grower. Sometimes I think people are able to pay more even the smaller producers like you hear.
Yeah.
I think it happens maybe more like in Lodi,
Sure.
people are getting like $800 a ton. And it's like, well, farm it a little better, could be $1,500 a ton. I'm going to only buy 3 tons, not the entire field.
Right.
But
There's
hopefully
opportunity.
a way forward
Yeah.
with some of that, even if it's breaking off a few tons
Right.
for somebody.
Right.
But those vineyards, they can get their name on the label maybe also, and kind of start like a little branding kind of thing.
Well, I
instead
think
of going into like just a bulk
right.
basis
Yeah.
blend.
It is interesting how the rise of the vineyard designated, property. And I know that, I'm guilty of this myself in that, I have vineyard names that people will look at and go, well, I've never heard of that vineyard. Why should I believe it's good? And, I tell people it's like, well, I'm doing it because I want to pay homage to where it's at and because it does come from one place. But, when I first started coming up, there weren't nearly as many vineyard designated wines.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But the ones that were named were that way because they were of the highest quality. And so that maybe that's been bastardized a little bit, but I think it's done with the right with the right thing in their heart when you try to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've definitely picked up wines because from, maybe a producer I'm not familiar with, because I'm like, I've had, 5 other wines from this vineyard.
Absolutely.
And they've all been great. So like, let me take a chance on this wine, that I'm not familiar with. So yeah. And I mean, I guess like you said a bit earlier, there's so many more smaller producers now. I mean, it's just it exploded in the amount of producers.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Do you feel like in the Kenwood days, more of those vineyards were kind of like a monopole or estate sort of vineyard? Like they're buying the entire field.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at Kenwood we had a couple different vineyard designated wines. That was it. There was, Beltane Chardonnay. There was Jack London. And that was about it. There was, the Reserve, or, we had the Artist Series, which was our Reserve.
Yeah.
That meant a lot more, and, we would joke that the Benzigers, with the Proprietor's Reserve, like they were the first to kind of bastardize the idea of reserve, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, there were definitely much less, and that's changed a lot. So estate meant more then, because now estate can just mean that you're in control of the farming. Mm-hmm. That's been a change also. So, but
yeah,
the iconic ones are still there and will always be there. Mm-hmm. And I think there are vineyards that weren't vineyard designated wines a couple years ago, that have become that. And, I think if I'll give credit to Morgan and Joel Peterson, and that, a whole bunch of Bedrock Vineyard was just farmed for production and not for quality for so long.
I was just going to say that vineyard is as one that, like, now it's like the esteem it's held in as far as the farming and the fruit coming off of it.
Right.
But
and that can go opposite also. There are definitely vineyards that, were at one point, quote unquote iconic, that because of not wanting to put the money into the farming, the ownership of the winery making the wine, it's lost its prestige, right?
Sure.
I mean, you could say that about the Jack London vineyard, At one point it was a unique bottling of Cabernet and Zinfandel because of where it was from. And during that time, Kenwood grew it into something. And, once ownership changed to a liquor company based in, France, that was less important, but yet they still produced the wine, but it was less about the quality. It was more about just, it became a label that was,
nothing special about it.
Nothing special about it, right.
Can charge twice as much for it.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, to be honest, they couldn't charge twice as much for it because they didn't build the brand enough, right? Like they took away from the brand, and so people, they had to keep selling it for $25 a bottle when their comparative brands from other producers were a lot more. So,
Yeah. But I am hopeful about the industry.
That's good.
Industry, and try to highlight the positive aspects.
Absolutely.
Here, So I really appreciate what you guys do on Winemakers.
Thanks.
I mean, it's been a big influence, and I'm not sure if I've listened to all 400, but I've listened to a pretty good chunk.
There's some there that are better not listened to be quite honest. In those early days, we would record 2 podcasts in a day. And, there were days where you could definitely tell that we weren't spitting out the wines on the second podcast if you were paying attention that close.
Yeah. I think the first one I actually listened to was the Craig Harmeyer
Yeah.
one. Yeah, I think that was the first one. Who I've always enjoyed his wines, and he was someone that was nice enough to come on my podcast before I had anything to actually show for it. No episodes out.
Oh, is that right?
You know, like
yeah.
he was I think the third one, but I didn't have any. You know, he just did it on for the kindness of his heart. You know, so
That's awesome. That's great. That's great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this today, and it's been really fun.
Likewise.
Yeah, getting to know you better, and I think we talked about once before. We'd probably be a good point to have you on our podcast sometime.
I'd love that. Yeah,
and just let you talk about some of your highlights, and break down a little bit about what you love about wine. So
I'd love
to
that.
do that. Yeah,
awesome. Thanks,
all right,
Bart.
awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Drink more Zinfandel, folks.
Thanks for listening today. Bart really is crafting some delicious and complex Sonoma Valley wines. You can really hear his love for the area in his voice. You can find the wines at danesellars.com or follow him at Dane _Cellars. You should, of course, also listen to the Winemakers podcast every Friday. Please follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. You can email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com or Instagram with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast helps a lot too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses, keeps it ad-free, available for everyone, allows for more episodes, and helps support some independent winemakers. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.